Chapter 45 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Deans. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 45. Curious Shifts of the Poor. The gloomy Hurstwood, sitting in his cheap hotel, where he had taken refuge with $70, the price of his furniture, between him and nothing, saw a hot summer out and a cool fall in, reading. He was not wholly indifferent to the fact that his money was slipping away. As 50 cents after 50 cents were paid out for a day's lodging, he became uneasy and finally took a cheaper room, 35 cents a day, to make his money last longer. Frequently he saw notices of Carrie. Her picture was in the World once or twice, and an old herald he found in a chair informed him that she had recently appeared with some others at a benefit for something or other. He read these things with mingled feelings. Each one seemed to put her farther and farther away into a realm which became more imposing as it receded from him. On the billboards, too, he saw a pretty poster showing her as the Quaker maid, demure and dainty. More than once he stopped and looked at these, gazing at the pretty face in a sullen sort of way. His clothes were shabby, and he presented a marked contrast to all that she now seemed to be. Somehow, so long as he knew she was at the casino, though he had never any intention of going near her, there was a subconscious comfort for him. He was not quite alone. The show seemed such a fixture that after a month or two he began to take it for granted that it was still running. In September it went on the road, and he did not notice it. When all but $20 of his money was gone, he moved to a 15-cent lodging house in the Bowery, where there was a bare lounging room filled with tables and benches, as well as some chairs. Here his preference was to close his eyes and dream of other days, a habit which grew upon him. It was not sleep at first, but a mental hearkening back to scenes and incidents in his Chicago life. As the present became darker, the past grew brighter, and all that concerned it stood in relief. He was unconscious of just how much this habit had hold of him, until one day he found his lips repeating an old answer he had made to one of his friends. They were in Fitzgerald and Moy's. It was as if he stood in the door of his elegant little office, comfortably dressed, talking to Sager Morrison about the value of South Chicago real estate, in which the latter was about to invest. "How would you like to come in on that with me?" he heard Morrison say. "Not me," he answered, just as he had years before. "I have my hands full now." The movement of his lips aroused him. He wondered whether he had really spoken. The next time he noticed anything of the sort, he did talk. "Why don't you jump, you bloody fool?" he was saying. "Jump!" It was a funny English story he was telling to a company of actors. Even as his voice recalled him, he was smiling. A crusty old codger, sitting nearby, seemed disturbed. At least, he stared in a most pointed way. Hurstwood straightened up. The humor of the memory fled in an instant, and he felt ashamed. For relief, he left his chair and strolled out into the streets. One day, looking down the columns of the Evening World, he saw where a new play was at the casino. Instantly, he came to a mental halt. Carrie had gone. He remembered seeing a poster of her only yesterday, but no doubt it was one left uncovered by the new signs. Curiously, this fact shook him up. He had almost to admit that somehow he was depending on her being in the city. Now she was gone. He wondered how this important fact had skipped him. Goodness knows when she would be back now. Impelled by a nervous fear, he rose and went into the dingy hall, where he counted his remaining money unseen. There were but $10 in all. He wondered how all these other lodging-house people around him got along. They didn't seem to have anything. Perhaps they begged. Unquestionably they did. Many was the dime he had given to such as they in his day. He had seen other men asking for money on the streets. Maybe he could get some that way. There was horror in this thought. Sitting in the lodging-house room, he came to his last 50 cents. He had saved and counted until his health was affected. His stoutness was gone. With it, even the semblance of a fit in his clothes. Now he decided he must do something, and, walking about, saw another day go by, bringing him down to his last 20 cents. Not enough to eat for the morrow. Summoning all his courage, he crossed to Broadway and up to the Broadway Central Hotel. Within a block he halted, undecided. A big, heavy-faced porter was standing at one of the side entrances, looking out. Hurstwood proposed to appeal to him. Walking straight up, he was upon him before he could turn away. "My friend," he said, recognizing even in his plight the man's inferiority, "is there anything about this hotel that I could get to do?" The porter stared at him the while he continued to talk. "I'm out of work and out of money, and I've got to get something. It doesn't matter what. I don't care to talk about what I've been, but if you'd tell me how to get something to do, I'd be much obliged to you. It wouldn't matter if it only lasted a few days just now. I've got to have something." The porter still gazed, trying to look indifferent. Then, seeing that Hurstwood was about to go on, he said, "I've nothing to do with it. You'll have to ask inside." Curiously, this stirred Hurstwood to further effort. "I thought you might tell me." The fellow shook his head irritably. Inside went the ex-manager, and straight to an office off the clerk's desk. One of the managers of the hotel happened to be there. Hurstwood looked him straight in the eye. "Could you give me something to do for a few days?" he said. "I'm in a position where I have to get something at once." The comfortable manager looked at him as much as to say, "Well, I should judge so." "I came here," explained Hurstwood nervously, "because I've been a manager myself in my day. I've had bad luck in a way, but I'm not here to tell you that. I want something to do, if only for a week." The man imagined he saw a feverish gleam in the applicant's eye. "What hotel did you manage?" he inquired. "It wasn't a hotel," said Hurstwood. "I was manager of Fitzgerald and Moy's place, in Chicago for 15 years. "Is that so?" said the hotel man. "How did you come to get out of that?" The figure of Hurstwood was rather surprisingly in contrast to the fact. "Well, by foolishness of my own. It isn't anything to talk about now. You could find out if you wanted to. I'm broke now, and if you will believe me, I haven't eaten anything today." The hotel man was slightly interested in this story. He could hardly tell what to do with such a figure, and yet Hurstwood's earnestness made him wish to do something. "Call Olson," he said, turning to the clerk. In reply to a bell and a disappearing hallboy, Olson, the head porter, appeared. "Olson," said the manager, "is there anything downstairs you could find for this man to do? I'd like to give him something." "I don't know, sir," said Olson. "We have about all the help we need. I think I could find something, sir, though, if you like." "Do. Take him to the kitchen and tell Wilson to give him something to eat." "All right, sir," said Olson. Hurstwood followed. Out of the manager's sight, the head porter's manner changed. "I don't know what the devil there is to do," he observed. Hurstwood said nothing. To him, the big trunk hustler was a subject for private contempt. "You're to give this man something to eat," he observed to the cook. The latter looked Hurstwood over, and seeing something keen and intellectual in his eyes, said, "Well, sit down over there." Thus was Hurstwood installed in the Broadway Central, but not for long. He was in no shape or mood to do the scrub work that exists about the foundation of every hotel. Nothing better offering, he was set to aid the firemen, to work about the basement, to do anything and everything that might offer. Porters, cooks, firemen, clerks, all were over him. Moreover, his appearance did not please these individuals. His temper was too lonely, and they made it disagreeable for him. With all this stolidity and indifference of despair, however, he endured it all, sleeping in an attic at the roof of the house, eating what the cook gave him, accepting a few dollars a week, which he tried to save. His constitution was in no shape to endure. One day, the following February, he was sent on an errand to a large coal company's office. It had been snowing and thawing, and the streets were sloppy. He soaked his shoes in his progress, and came back feeling dull and weary. All the next day he felt unusually depressed, and sat about as much as possible, to the irritation of those who admired energy in others. In the afternoon some boxes were to be moved to make room for new culinary supplies. He was ordered to handle a truck. Encountering a big box, he could not lift it. "What's the matter there?" said the head porter. "Can't you handle it?" He was straining hard to lift it, but now he quit. "No," he said weakly. The man looked at him and saw that he was deathly pale. "Not sick, are you?" he asked. "I think I am," returned Hurstwood. "Well, you'd better go sit down then." This he did, but soon grew rapidly worse. It seemed all he could do was to crawl to his room, where he remained for a day. "That man Wheeler's sick," reported one of the lackeys to the night clerk. "What's the matter with him?" "I don't know. He's got a high fever." The hotel physician looked at him. "Better send him to Bellevue," he recommended. "He's got pneumonia." Accordingly, he was carted away. In 3 weeks the worst was over, but it was nearly the 1st of May before his strength permitted him to be turned out. Then he was discharged. No more weakly-looking object ever strolled out into the spring sunshine than the once hale, lusty manager. All his corpulency had fled. His face was thin and pale, his hands white, his body flabby. Clothes and all, he weighed about 135 pounds. Some old garments had been given him, a cheap brown coat and a misfit pair of trousers. Also some change in advice. He was told to apply to the charities. Again he resorted to the Bowery lodging-house, brooding over where to look. From this it was but a step to beggary. "What can a man do?" he said. "I can't starve." His first application was in sunny Second Avenue. A well-dressed man came leisurely strolling towards him out of Stuyvesant Park. Hurstwood nerved himself and sidled near. "Would you mind giving me 10 cents?" he said directly. "I'm in a position where I must ask someone." The man scarcely looked at him, but fished in his vest pocket and took out a dime. "There you are," he said. "Much obliged," said Hurstwood softly, but the other paid no more attention to him. Satisfied with his success, and yet ashamed of his situation, he decided that he could only ask for 25 cents more, since that would be sufficient. He strolled about, sizing up people, but it was long before just the right face and situation arrived. When he asked, he was refused. Shocked by this result, he took an hour to recover, and then asked again. This time a nickel was given him. By the most watchful effort, he did get 20 cents more, but it was painful. The next day he resorted to the same effort, experiencing a variety of rebuffs and 1 or 2 generous receptions. At last it crossed his mind that there was a science of faces, and that a man could pick the liberal countenance if he tried. It was no pleasure to him, however, this stopping of passers-by. He saw one man taken up for it, and now troubled lest he should be arrested. Nevertheless, he went on, vaguely anticipating that infinite something which is always better. It was with a sense of satisfaction, then, that he saw announced one morning the return of the casino company, with Miss Carrie Medenda. He had thought of her often enough in days past. How successful she was, how much money she must have. Even now, however, it took a severe run of ill luck to decide him to appeal to her. He was truly hungry before he said, "I'll ask her. She won't refuse me a few dollars." Accordingly, he headed for the casino one afternoon, passed it several times in an effort to locate the stage entrance. Then he sat in Bryant Park, a block away, waiting. "She can't refuse to help me a little," he kept saying to himself. Beginning with 6:30, he hovered like a shadow about the 39th Street entrance, pretending always to be a hurrying pedestrian, and yet fearful lest he should miss his object. He was slightly nervous, too, now that the eventful hour had arrived, but being weak and hungry, his ability to suffer was modified. At last he saw the actors were beginning to arrive, and his nervous tension increased, until it seemed as if he could not stand much more. Once he thought he saw Carrie coming, and moved forward, only to see he was mistaken. "She can't be long now," he said to himself, half fearing to encounter her, and equally depressed at the thought that she might have gone in by another way. His stomach was so empty that it ached. Individual after individual passed him, nearly all well-dressed, almost all indifferent. He saw coaches rolling by, gentlemen passing with ladies. The evening's merriment was beginning in this region of theaters and hotels. Suddenly a coach rolled up, and the driver jumped down to open the door. Before Hurstwood could act, two ladies flounced across the broad walk and disappeared into the stage door. He thought he saw Carrie, but it was so unexpected, so elegant and far away, he could hardly tell. He waited a while longer, growing feverish with want, and then seeing that the stage door no longer opened, and that a merry audience was arriving, he concluded it must have been Carrie, and turned away. "Lord," he said, hastening out of the street, into which the more fortunate were pouring, "I've got to get something." At that hour, when Broadway is wont to assume its most interesting aspect, a peculiar individual invariably took his stand at the corner of 26th Street and Broadway, a spot which is also intersected by Fifth Avenue. This was the hour when the theaters were just beginning to receive their patrons. Fire signs announcing the night's amusements blazed on every hand. Cabs and carriages, their lights gleaming like yellow eyes, pattered by. Couples and parties of 3 and 4 freely mingled in the common crowd, which poured by in a thick stream, laughing and jesting. On Fifth Avenue were loungers, a few wealthy strollers, a gentleman in evening dress with a lady on his arm, some clubmen passing from one smoking room to another. Across the way the great hotels showed 100 gleaming windows, their cafes and billiard rooms filled with a comfortable, well-dressed, and pleasure-loving throng. All about was the night, pulsating with the thoughts of pleasure and exhilaration, the city bent upon finding joy in 1,000 different ways. This unique individual was no less than an ex-soldier turned religionist, who, having suffered the whips and privations of our peculiar social system, had concluded that his duty to the God which he conceived lay in aiding his fellow man. The form of aid which he chose to administer was entirely original with himself. It consisted of securing a bed for all such homeless wayfarers as should apply to him at this particular spot, though he had scarcely the wherewithal to provide a comfortable habitation for himself. Taking his place amid this lightsome atmosphere, he would stand his stocky figure, cloaked in a great white cape overcoat, his head protected by a broad slouch hat, awaiting the applicants who had in various ways learned the nature of his charity. For a while he would stand alone, gazing like some idler upon an ever-fascinating scene. On the evening in question, a policeman passing saluted him as captain in a friendly way. An urchin who had frequently seen him before stopped to gaze. All others took him for nothing out of the ordinary, save in the manner of dress, and conceived of him as a stranger whistling and idling for his own amusement. As the first half-hour waned, certain characters appeared. Here and there in the passing crowds one might see, now and then, a loiterer edging interestingly near. A slouchy figure crossed the opposite corner and glanced furtively in his direction. Another came down Fifth Avenue to the corner of 26th Street, took a general survey, and bobbled off again. 2 or 3 noticeable Bowery types edged along the Fifth Avenue side of Madison Square, but did not venture over. The soldier, in his cape overcoat, walked a short line of 10 feet to his corner, to and fro, indifferently whistling. As 9 o'clock approached, some of the hubbub of the earlier hour passed. The atmosphere of the hotels was not so youthful. The air, too, was colder. On every hand, curious figures were moving, watchers and peepers, without an imaginary circle, which they seemed afraid to enter, a dozen in all. Presently, with the arrival of a keener sense of cold, one figure came forward. It crossed Broadway from out of the shadow of 26th Street, and in a halting, circuitous way, arrived close to the waiting figure. There was somewhat shamefaced or diffident about the movement, as if the intention was to conceal any idea of stopping until the very last moment. Then, suddenly, close to the soldier, came the halt. The captain looked in recognition, but there was no especial greeting. The newcomer nodded slightly and murmured something like one who waits for gifts. The others simply motioned towards the edge of the walk. "Stand over there," he said. By this the spell was broken. Even while the soldier resumed his short, solemn walk, other figures shuffled forward. They did not so much as greet the leader, but joined the one, sniffling and hitching and scraping their feet. "Cold, ain't it? I'm glad winter's over. Looks as though it might rain." The motley company had increased to 10. 1 or 2 knew each other and conversed. Others stood off a few feet, not wishing to be in the crowd and yet not counted out. They were peevish, crusty, silent, eyeing nothing in particular, and moving their feet. There would have been talking soon, but the soldier gave them no chance. Counting sufficient to begin, he came forward. "Beds, all of you?" There was a general shuffle and murmur of approval. "Well, line up here. I'll see what I can do. I haven't a cent myself." They fell into a sort of broken, ragged line. One might see now some of the chief characteristics by contrast. There was a wooden leg in the line. Hats were all drooping, a group that would ill become a second-hand Hester Street basement collection. Trousers were all warped and frayed at the bottom, and coats worn and faded. In the glare of the store lights, some of the faces looked dry and chalky. Others were red with blotches and puffed in the cheeks and under the eyes. 1 or 2 were raw-boned and reminded one of railroad hands. A few spectators came near, drawn by the seemingly conferring group. Then more and more, and quickly there was a pushing, gasping crowd. Someone in the line began to talk. "Silence!" exclaimed the captain. "Now then, gentlemen, these men are without beds. They have to have some place to sleep tonight. They can't lie out on the streets. I need 12 cents to put one of them to bed. Who will give it to me?" No reply. Well, we'll have to wait here, boys, until someone does. 12 cents isn't so very much for one man. Here's 15, exclaimed a young man, peering forward with strained eyes. It's all I can afford. All right, now I have 15. Step out of the line. And seizing one by the shoulder, the captain marched him off a little way and stood him up alone. Coming back, he resumed his place and began again. I have 3 cents left. These men must be put to bed somehow. There are, counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 men. 9 cents more will put the next man to bed. Give him a good, comfortable bed for the night. I go right along and look after that myself. Who will give me 9 cents? One of the watchers, this time a middle-aged man, handed him a 5-cent piece. Now I have 8 cents. 4 more will give this man a bed. Come, gentlemen, we are going very slow this evening. You all have good beds. How about these? Here you are, remarked a passer-by, putting a coin in his hand. That, said the captain, looking at the coin, pays for 2 beds for 2 men, and gives me 5 on the next one. Who will give me 7 cents more? I will, said a voice. Coming down 6th Avenue this evening, Hurstwood chanced to cross east through 26th Street toward 3rd Avenue. He was wholly disconsolate in spirit, hungry to what he deemed an almost mortal extent, weary and defeated. How should he get at Carrie now? It would be 11 before the show was over. If she came in a coach, she would go away in one. He would need to interrupt under most trying circumstances. Worst of all, he was hungry and weary, and at best a whole day must intervene, for he had not heart to try again tonight. He had no food and no bed. When he neared Broadway, he noticed the captain's gathering of wanderers, but thinking it to be the result of a street preacher or some patent medicine faker, was about to pass on. However, in crossing the street toward Madison Square Park, he noticed the line of men whose beds were already secured, stretching out from the main body of the crowd. In the glare of the neighboring electric light, he recognized a type of his own kind. The figures whom he saw about the streets and in the lodging-houses, drifting in mind and body, like himself. He wondered what it could be, and turned back. There was the captain, curtly pleading as before. He heard with astonishment and a sense of relief the oft-repeated words, "These men must have a bed." Before him was the line of unfortunates whose beds were yet to be had, and seeing a newcomer quietly edge up and take a position at the end of the line, he decided to do likewise. What else to contend? He was weary tonight, and it was a simple way out of one difficulty at least. Tomorrow, maybe, he would do better. Back of him were some of those whose beds were safe. A relaxed air was apparent. The strain of uncertainty being removed, he heard them talking with moderate freedom, and some leaning toward social ability. Politics, religion, the state of the government, some newspaper sensations, and the more notorious facts the world over, found mouthpieces and auditors there. Cracked and husky voices pronounced forcibly upon odd matters. Vague and rambling observations were made in reply. There were squints and leers, and some dull, ox-like stares from those who were too dull or too weary to converse. Standing tells. Hurstwood became more weary waiting. He thought he should drop soon, and shifted restlessly from one foot to the other. At last his turn came. The man ahead had been paid for and gone to the blessed line of success. He was now first, and already the captain was talking for him. 12 cents, gentlemen, 12 cents puts this man to bed. He wouldn't stand here in the cold if he had any place to go. Hurstwood swallowed something that rose to his throat. Hunger and weakness had made a coward of him. "Here you are," said the stranger, handing money to the captain. Now the latter put a kindly hand on the ex-manager's shoulder. "Line up over there," he said. Once again Hurstwood breathed easier. He felt as if the world were not quite so bad, with such a good man in it. Others seemed to feel like himself about this. "Captain's a great feller, ain't he?" said the man ahead, a little woebegone, helpless-looking sort of individual, who looked as though he had ever been the sport and care of fortune. "Yes," said Hurstwood indifferently. "Hub, there's a lot back there yet," said a man farther up, leaning out and looking back at the applicants for whom the captain was pleading. "Yes, must be over 100 tonight," said another. "Look at that guy in the cab," observed a third. A cab had stopped. Some gentleman in evening dress reached out a bill to the captain, who took it with simple thanks and turned away to his line. There was a general craning of necks as the jewel in the white shirt front sparkled, and the cab moved off. Even the crowd gaped in awe. "That fixes up 9 men for the night," said the captain, counting out as many of the line near him. "Line up over there. Now then, there are only 7. I need 12 cents. Money came slowly. In the course of time the crowd thinned out to a meager handful. Fifth Avenue, save for an occasional cab or foot passenger, was bare. Broadway was thinly peopled with pedestrians. Only now and then a stranger passing noticed the small group, handed out a coin, and went away unheeding. The captain remained stolid and determined. He talked on, very slowly, uttering the fewest words, and with a certain assurance, as though he could not fail. "Come, I can't stay out here all night. These men are getting tired and cold. Someone give me 4 cents. There came a time when he said nothing at all. Money was handed him, and for each 12 cents he singled out a man and put him in the other line. Then he walked up and down as before, looking at the ground. The theaters let out. Fire signs disappeared. A clock struck 11. Another half hour, and he was down to the last 2 men. "Come now," he explained to several curious observers. 18 cents will fix us all up for the night. 18 cents. I have 6. Someone give me the money. Remember, I have to go over to Brooklyn yet tonight. Before that, I have to take these men down and put them to bed. 18 cents. No one responded. He walked to and fro, looking down for several minutes, occasionally saying softly, 18 cents. It seemed as if this paltry sum would delay the desired culmination longer than all the rest had. Hurstwood, buoyed up slightly by the long line of which he was a part, refrained with an effort from groaning. He was so weak. At last a lady in opera cape and rustling skirts came down Fifth Avenue, accompanied by her escort. Hurstwood gazed wearily, reminded by her both of Carrie in her new world and of the time when he had escorted his own wife in like manner. While he was gazing, she turned, and, looking at the remarkable company, sent her escort over. He came, holding a bell in his fingers, all elegant and graceful. "Here you are," he said. "Thanks," said the captain, turning to the two remaining applicants. "Now we have some for tomorrow night," he added. Therewith he lined up the last two and proceeded to the head, counting as he went. 137, he announced. "Now, boys, line up. Right dress here. We won't be much longer about this. Steady now." He placed himself at the head and called out, "Forward." Hurstwood moved with the line, across Fifth Avenue, through Madison Square, by the winding paths, east on 23rd Street, and down 3rd Avenue wound the long serpentine company. Midnight pedestrians and loiterers stopped and stared as the company passed. Chatting policemen at various corners stared indifferently or nodded to the leader, whom they had seen before. On 3rd Avenue they marched, a seemingly weary way, to 8th Street, where there was a lodging-house, closed, apparently, for the night. They were expected, however. Outside in the gloom they stood, while the leader parleyed within. Then doors swung open, and they were invited in with a "Steady now." Someone was at the head showing rooms, so that there was no delay for keys. Toiling up the creaky stairs, Hurstwood looked back and saw the captain watching, the last one of the line being included in his broad solicitude. Then he gathered his cloak about him and strolled out into the night. "I can't stand much of this," said Hurstwood, whose legs ached him painfully, as he sat down upon the miserable bunk in the small, lightless chamber allotted to him. "I've got to eat, or I'll die." End of chapter 45. Recording by Andrea Deans. Chapter 46 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Deans. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 46. Stirring Troubled Waters. Playing in New York one evening, upon this her return, Carrie was putting the finishing touches to her toilet before leaving for the night, when a commotion near the stage door caught her ear. It included a familiar voice. "Never mind now. I want to see Miss Medenda. You'll have to send in your card." "Oh, come off, here." A $50 was passed over, and now a knock came at her dressing-room door. Carrie opened it. "Well, well," said Druitt, "I do swear. Why, how are you? I knew that was you the moment I saw you." Carrie fell back a pace, expecting a most embarrassing conversation. "Aren't you going to shake hands with me? Well, you're a dandy. That's all right. Shake hands." Carrie put out her hand, smiling, if for nothing more than the man's exuberant good nature. Though older, he was but slightly changed. The same fine clothes, the same stocky body, the same rosy countenance. "That fellow at the door didn't want to let me in until I paid him. I knew it was you all right. Say, you've got a great show. You do your part fine. I knew you would. I just happened to be passing tonight and thought I'd drop in for a few minutes. I saw your name on the program, but I didn't remember it until you came on stage. Then it struck me all at once. Say, you could have knocked me down with a feather. That's the same name you used out there in Chicago, isn't it?" "Yes," answered Carrie, mildly, overwhelmed by the man's assurance. "I knew it was the moment I saw you. Well, how've you been, anyhow?" "Oh, very well," said Carrie, lingering in her dressing-room. She was rather dazed by the assault. "How have you been?" "Me? Oh, fine. I'm here now." "Is that so?" said Carrie. "Yes. I've been here for 6 months. I've got charge of a branch here." "How nice." "Well, when did you go on the stage, anyhow?" inquired Druitt. "About 3 years ago," said Carrie. "You don't say. Well, sir, this is the first I've heard of it. I knew you would, though. I always said you could act, didn't I?" Carrie smiled. "Yes, you did," she said. "Well, you do look great," he said. "I never saw anyone improve so. You're taller, aren't you?" "Me? Oh, a little, maybe." He gazed at her dress, then at her hair, where a becoming hat was set jauntily, then into her eyes, which she took all occasion to avert. Evidently he expected to restore their old friendship at once and without modification. "Well," he said, seeing her gather up her purse, handkerchief, and the like, preparatory to departing, "I want you to come out tonight with me, won't you? I've got a friend out here." "Oh, I can't," said Carrie. "Not tonight. I have an early engagement tomorrow." "Aw, let the engagement go. Come on. I can get rid of him. I want to have a good talk with you." No, said Carrie. "I can't. You mustn't ask me any more. I don't care for a late dinner." "Well, come on and have a talk then, anyhow." "Not tonight," she said, shaking her head. "We'll have a talk some other time." As a result of this, she noticed a shade of thought pass over his face, as if he were beginning to realize that things were changed. Good nature dictated something better than this for one who had always liked her. "You come around to the hotel tomorrow," she said, as sort of penance for error. "You could take dinner with me." "All right," said Druitt, brightening. "Where are you stopping?" "At the Waldorf," she answered, mentioning the fashionable hostelry, then but newly erected. "What time?" "Well, come at 3, said Carrie pleasantly. The next day Druitt called, but it was with no especial delight that Carrie remembered her appointment. However, seeing him, handsome as ever, after his kind, and most genially disposed, her doubts as to whether the dinner would be disagreeable were swept away. He talked as volubly as ever. "They put on a lot of lugs here, don't they?" was his first remark. "Yes, they do," said Carrie. Genial egotist that he was, he went at once into a detailed account of his own career. "I'm going to have a business of my own pretty soon," he observed in one place. "I can get backing for $200,000. Carrie listened most good-naturedly. "Say," he said suddenly, "where's Hurstwood now?" Carrie flushed a little. "He's here in New York, I guess," she said. "I haven't seen him for some time." Drouet mused for a moment. He had not been sure until now that the ex-manager was not an influential figure in the background. He imagined not, but this assurance relieved him. It must be that Carrie had got rid of him, as well she ought, he thought. "A man always makes a mistake when he does anything like that," he observed. "Like what?" said Carrie, unwitting of what was coming. "Oh, you know," said Drouet, waving her intelligence, as it were, with his hand. "No, I don't," she answered. "What do you mean?" "Why, that affair in Chicago, the time he left." "I don't know what you're talking about," said Carrie. Could it be he would refer so rudely to Hurstwood's flight with her? "Oh, ho!" said Drouet incredulously. "You knew he took $10,000 with him when he left, didn't you?" "What?" said Carrie. "You don't mean he stole the money, do you?" "Why," said Drouet, puzzled at her tone, "you knew that, didn't you?" "Why, no," said Carrie. "Of course I didn't." "Well, that's funny," said Drouet. "He did, you know. It was in all the papers." "How much did you say he took?" said Carrie. $10,000. I heard he sent most of it back afterwards, though." Carrie looked vacantly at the richly carpeted floor. A new light was shining upon all the years since her enforced flight. She remembered now 100 things that indicated as much. She also imagined that he took it on her account. Instead of hatred springing up, there was a kind of sorrow generated. Poor fellow! What a thing to have had hanging over his head all the time. At dinner, Drouet, warned by eating and drinking and softened in mood, fancied he was winning Carrie to her old-time, good-natured regard for him. He began to imagine it would not be so difficult to enter into her life again, high as she was. Ah, what a prize, he thought. How beautiful, how elegant, how famous. In her theatrical and Waldorf setting, Carrie was to him the all-desirable. "Do you remember how nervous you were that night at the Avery?" he asked. Carrie smiled to think of it. "I never saw anybody do better than you did, Cad," he added ruefully, as he leaned an elbow on the table. "I thought you and I were going to get along fine those days." "You mustn't talk that way," said Carrie, bringing in the least touch of coldness. "Won't you let me tell you?" "No," she answered, rising. "Besides, it's time I was getting ready for the theater. I'll have to leave you now. Come now." "Oh, stay a minute," pleaded Drouet. "You've got plenty of time." "No," said Carrie gently. Reluctantly, Drouet gave up the bright table and followed. He saw her to the elevator and, standing there, said, "When do I see you again?" "Oh, sometime, possibly," said Carrie. "I'll be here all summer. Good night." The elevator door was open. "Good night," said Drouet as she rustled in. Then he strolled sadly down the hall, all his old longing revived, because she was now so far off. He thought himself hardly dealt with. Carrie, however, had other thoughts. That night it was that she passed Hurstwood,
waiting at the casino without observing him. The next night, walking to the theater, she encountered him face to face. He was waiting, more gaunt than ever, determined to see her, if he had to send in word. At first, she did not recognize the shabby, baggy figure. He frightened her, edging so close, a seemingly hungry stranger. "Carrie," he half whispered, "can I have a few words with you?" She turned and recognized him on the instant. If there ever lurked any feeling in her heart against him, it deserted her now. Still, she remembered what Druitt said about his having stolen the money. "Why, George," she said, "what's the matter with you?" "I've been sick," he answered. "I just got out of the hospital. For God's sakes, let me have a little money, will you?" "Of course," said Carrie, her lip trembling in a strong effort to maintain her composure. "But what's the matter with you, anyhow?" She was opening her purse, and now pulled out all the bills in it, a 5 and 2 2s. "I've been sick, I told you," he said peevishly, almost resenting her excessive pity. It came hard to him to receive it from such a source. "Here," she said, "it's all I have with me." "All right," he answered softly. "I'll give it back to you some day." Carrie looked at him while pedestrians stared at her. She felt the strain of publicity. So did Hurstwood. "Why don't you tell me what's the matter with you?" she asked, hardly knowing what to do. "Where are you living?" "Oh, I've got a room down in the Bowery," he answered. "There's no use trying to tell you here. I'm all right now." He seemed in a way to resent her kindly inquiries. So much better had fate dealt with her. "Better go on in," he said. "I'm much obliged, but I won't bother you any more." She tried to answer, but he turned away and shuffled off toward the east. For days this apparition was a drag on her soul, before it began to wear partially away. Druitt called again, but now he was not even seen by her. His attention seemed out of place. "I'm out," was her reply to the boy. So peculiar, indeed, was her lonely, self-withdrawing temper, that she was becoming an interesting figure in the public eye. She was so quiet and reserved. Not long after the management decided to transfer the show to London, a second summer season did not seem to promise well here. "How would you like to try subduing London?" asked her manager one afternoon. "It might be just the other way," said Carrie. "I think we'll go in June," he answered. In the hurry of departure, Hurstwood was forgotten. Both he and Druitt were left to discover that she was gone. The latter called once and exclaimed at the news. Then he stood in the lobby, chewing the ends of his mustache. At last he reached a conclusion. The old days had gone for good. "She isn't so much," he said, but in his heart of hearts he did not believe this. Hurstwood shifted by curious means through a long summer and fall. A small job as janitor of a dance hall helped him for a month. Begging, sometimes going hungry, sometimes sleeping in the park, carried him over more days. Resorting to those peculiar charities, several of which, in the press of hungry search, he accidentally stumbled upon, did the rest. Toward the dead of winter, Carrie came back, appearing on Broadway in a new play, but he was not aware of it. For weeks he wandered about the city begging, while the fire sign announcing her engagement blazed nightly upon the crowded street of amusements. Druitt saw it, but did not venture in. About this time, Ames returned to New York. He had made a little success in the West, and now opened a laboratory in Wooster Street. Of course, he encountered Carrie through Mrs. Vance, but there was nothing responsive between them. He thought she was still united to Hurstwood, until otherwise informed. Not knowing the facts then, he did not profess to understand, and refrained from comment. With Mrs. Vance, he saw the new play, and expressed himself accordingly. "She ought not to be in comedy," he said. "I think she could do better than that." One afternoon they met at the Vances accidentally, and began a very friendly conversation. She could hardly tell why the one-time keen interest in him was no longer with her. Unquestionably, it was because at that time he had represented something which she did not have, but this she did not understand. Success had given her the momentary feeling that she was now blessed with much of which he would approve. As a matter of fact, her little newspaper fame was nothing at all to him. He thought she could have done better, by far. "You didn't go into comedy drama after all," he said, remembering her interest in that form of art. "No," she answered, "I haven't so far." He looked at her in such a peculiar way that she realized she had failed. It moved her to add, "I want to, though." "I should think you would," he said. "You have the sort of disposition that would do well in comedy drama." It surprised her that he should speak of disposition. Was she, then, so clearly in his mind? "Why?" she asked. "Well," he said, "I should judge you were rather sympathetic in your nature." Carrie smiled and colored slightly. He was so innocently frank with her that she drew nearer in friendship. The old call of the ideal was sounding. "I don't know," she answered, pleased, nevertheless, beyond all concealment. "I saw your play," he remarked. "It's very good." "I'm glad you liked it." "Very good indeed," he said, "for a comedy." This is all that was said at the time, owing to an interruption, but later they met again. He was sitting in a corner after dinner, staring at the floor, when Carrie came up with another of the guests. Hard work had given his face the look of one who is weary. It was not for Carrie to know the thing in it which appealed to her. "All alone?" she said. "I was listening to music." "I'll be back in a moment," said her companion, who saw nothing in the inventor. Now he looked up in her face, for she was standing a moment while he sat. "Isn't that a pathetic strain?" he inquired, listening. "Oh, very," she returned, also catching it, now that her attention was called. "Sit down," he added, offering her the chair beside him. They listened a few moments in silence, touched by the same feeling, only hers reached her through the heart. Music still charmed her as in the old days. "I don't know what it is about music," she started to say, moved by the inexplicable longings which surged within her, "but it always makes me feel as if I wanted something. Yes," he replied, "I know how you feel." Suddenly he turned to considering the peculiarity of her disposition, expressing her feelings so frankly. "You ought not to be melancholy," he said. He thought a while, and then went off into a seemingly alien observation, which, however, accorded with their feelings. "The world is full of desirable situations, but, unfortunately, we can occupy but one at a time. It doesn't do us any good to wring our hands over the far-off things. The music ceased, and he arose, taking a standing position before her, as if to rest himself. "Why don't you get into some good, strong comedy drama?" he said. He was looking directly at her now, studying her face. Her large, sympathetic eyes and pain-touched mouth appealed to him as proofs of his judgment. "Perhaps I shall," she returned. "That's your field," he added. "Do you think so?" "Yes," he said, "I do. I don't suppose you're aware of it, but there's something about your eyes and your mouth which fits you for that sort of work." Carrie thrilled to be taken so seriously. For the moment, loneliness deserted her. Here was praise which was keen and analytical. "It's in your eyes and mouth," he went on abstractedly. "I remember thinking, the first time I saw you, that there was something peculiar about your mouth. I thought you were about to cry." "How odd," said Carrie, warm with delight. This was what her heart craved. "Then I noticed that was your natural look, and tonight I saw it again. There's a shadow about your eyes, too, which gives your face much the same character. It's in the depth of them, I think." Carrie looked straight into his face, wholly aroused. "You're probably not aware of it," he added. She looked away, pleased that he should speak thus, longing to be equal to this feeling written upon her countenance. It unlocked the door to a new desire. She had cause to ponder over this until they met again, several weeks or more. It showed her she was drifting away from the old ideal which filled her in the dressing rooms of the Avery stage and thereafter for a long time. Why had she lost it? "I know why you should be a success," he said another time. "If you had a more dramatic part, I studied it out." "What is it?" said Carrie. "Well," he said, as one pleased with a puzzle, "that expression in your face is one that comes out in different things. You get the same thing in a pathetic song or any picture which moves you deeply. It's a thing the world likes to see because it's a natural expression of its longing." Carrie gazed without exactly getting the import of what he meant. "The world is always struggling to express itself," he went on. "Most people are not capable of voicing their feelings. They depend upon others. That is what genius is for. One man expresses their desires for them in music, another one in poetry, another one in a play. Sometimes nature does it in a face. It makes the face representative of all desire. That's what has happened in your case." He looked at her with so much of the import of the thing in his eyes that she caught it. At least she got the idea that her look was something which represented the world's longing. She took it to heart as a credible thing until he added, "That puts a burden of duty on you. It so happens that you have this thing. It is no credit to you. That is, I mean, you might not have had it. You paid nothing to get it. But now that you have it, you must do something with it." "What?" asked Carrie. "I should say, turn to the dramatic field. You have so much sympathy and such a melodious voice. Make them valuable to others. It will make your powers endure." Carrie did not understand this last. All her comedy success was little or nothing. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Well, just this. You have this quality in your eyes and mouth and in your nature. You can lose it, you know. If you turn away from it and live to satisfy yourself alone, it will go fast enough. The look will leave your eyes. Your mouth will change. your power to act will disappear. You may think they won't, but they will. Nature takes care of that. He was so interested in forwarding all good causes that he sometimes became enthusiastic, giving vent to these preachments. Something in Carrie appealed to him. He wanted to stir her up. "I know," she said absently, feeling slightly guilty of neglect. "If I were you," he said, "I'd change." The effect of this was like roiling helpless waters. Carrie troubled over it in a rocking chair for days. "I don't believe I'll stay in comedy so very much longer," she eventually remarked to Lola. "So why not?" said the latter. "I think," she said, "I can do better in a serious play." "What put that idea in your head?" "Oh, nothing," she answered. "I've always thought so." Still, she did nothing, grieving. It was a long way to do this better thing, or seemed so, and comfort was about her, hence the inactivity and longing. End of chapter 46. Recording by Andrea Deans. Chapter 47 of Sister Carrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Deans. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. Chapter 47. The Way of the Beaten, A Harp in the Wind. In the city at that time, there were a number of charities similar in nature to that of the captain's, which Hurstwood now patronized in a like unfortunate way. One was a convent mission house of the Sisters of Mercy in 15th Street, a row of red brick family dwellings, before the door of which hung a plain wooden contribution box, on which was painted the statement that every noon a meal was given free to all those who might apply and ask for aid. This simple announcement was modest in the extreme, covering, as it did, charity so broad. Institutions and charities were so large and so numerous in New York that such things as this are not often noticed by the more comfortably situated, but to those whose mind is upon the matter, they grow exceedingly under inspection. Unless one were looking up this matter in particular, he could have stood at 6th Avenue and 15th Street for days around the noon hour, and never have noticed that out of the vast crowd that surged along that busy thoroughfare, there turned out, every few seconds, some weather-beaten, heavy-footed specimen of humanity, gaunt in countenance and dilapidated in the manner of clothes. The fact is none the less true, however, and the colder the day, the more apparent it became. Space and a lack of culinary room in the mission house compelled an arrangement which permitted of only 25 or 30 eating at one time, so that a line had to be formed outside and an orderly entrance effected. This caused a daily spectacle, which, however, had become so common by repetition during a number of years that now nothing was thought of it. The men waited patiently, like cattle, in the coldest weather, waited for several hours before they could be admitted. No questions were asked and no service rendered. They ate and went away again, some of them returning regularly, day after day, the winter through. A big motherly woman invariably stood guard at the door during the entire operation, and counted the admissible number. The men moved up in solemn order. There was no haste and no eagerness displayed. It was almost a dumb procession. In the bitterest weather, this line was to be found here. Under an icy wind, there was a prodigious slapping of hands and a dancing of feet. Fingers and the features of the face looked as if severely nipped by the cold. A study of these men in broad light proved them to be nearly all of a type. They belonged to the class that sit on the park benches during the endurable days and sleep upon them during the summer nights. They frequent the Bowery and those down at the heels East Side streets, where poor clothes and shrunken features are not singled out as curious. They are the men who are in the lodging-house sitting rooms during bleak and bitter weather, and who swarm about the cheaper shelters, which only open at 6, in a number of the lower East Side streets. Miserable food, ill-timed and greedily eaten, had played havoc with bone and muscle. They were all pale, flabby, sunken-eyed, hollow-chested, with eyes that glinted and shone, and lips that were a sickly red by contrast. Their hair was but half attended to, their ears anemic in hue, and their shoes broken in leather and run down at heel and toe. They were of the class which simply floats and drifts, every wave of people washing up one, as breakers do driftwood upon a stormy shore. For nearly a quarter of a century, in another section of the city, Fleischmann, the baker, had given a loaf of bread to anyone who would come for it to the side door of his restaurant at the corner of Broadway and 10th Street at midnight. Every night during 20 years, about 300 men had formed in line, and at the appointed time marched past the doorway, picked their loaf from a great box placed just outside, and vanished again into the night. From the beginning to the present time, there had been little change in the character or number of these men. There were 2 or 3 figures that had grown familiar to those who had seen this little procession pass year after year. 2 of them had scarcely missed a night in 15 years. There were about 40 more or less regular callers. The remainder of the line was formed of strangers. In times of panic and unusual hardships, there were seldom more than 300. In times of prosperity, when little is heard of the unemployed, there were seldom less. The same number, winter and summer, in storm or calm, in good times and bad, held this melancholy midnight rendezvous at Fleischmann's bread box. At both of these 2 charities, during the severe winter which was now on, Hurstwood was a frequent visitor. On one occasion it was peculiarly cold, and finding no comfort in begging about the streets, he waited until noon before seeking this free offering to the poor. Already at 11 o'clock of this morning, several such as he had shambled forward out of 6th Avenue, their thin clothes flapping and fluttering in the wind. They leaned against the iron railing which protects the walls of the 9th Regiment Armory, which fronts upon that section of 15th Street, having come early to be first in. Having an hour to wait, they at first lingered at a respectful distance, but others coming up, they moved closer in order to protect their right of precedence. To this collection Hurstwood came up from the west out of 7th Avenue and stopped close to the door, nearer than all the others. Those who had been waiting before him, but farther away, now drew near, and by a certain stolidity of demeanor, no words being spoken, indicated that they were first. Seeing the opposition to his action, he looked sullenly along the line, then moved out, taking his place at the foot. When order had been restored, the animal feeling of opposition relaxed. "Must be pretty near noon," ventured one. "It is," said another. "I've been waiting nearly an hour. Gee, but it's cold." They peered eagerly at the door, where all must enter. A grocery man drove up and carried in several baskets of eatables. This started some words upon grocerymen and the cost of food in general. "I see meat's gone up," said one. "If there was war, it would help this country a lot." The line was growing rapidly. Already there were 50 or more, and those at the head, by their demeanor, evidently congratulated themselves upon not having so long to wait as those at the foot. There was much jerking of heads and looking down the line. "It don't matter how near you get to the front, so long as you're in the first 25, commented one of the first 25. "You all go in together." "Humph," ejaculated Hurstwood, who had been so sturdily displaced. "This here single tax is a thing," said another. "There ain't going to be no order till it comes." For the most part, there was silence, gaunt men shuffling, glancing, and beating their arms. At last the door opened, and the motherly-looking sister appeared. She only looked in order. Slowly the line moved up, and one by one passed in, until 25 were counted. Then she interposed a stout arm, and the line halted, with 6 men on the steps. Of these, the ex-manager was one. Waiting thus, some talked, some ejaculated concerning the misery of it, some brooded, as did Hurstwood. At last he was admitted, and, having eaten, came away, almost angered because of his pains in getting in. At 11 o'clock of another evening, perhaps 2 weeks later, he was at the midnight offering of a loaf, waiting patiently. It had been an unfortunate day with him, but now he took his fate with a touch of philosophy. If he could secure no supper, or was hungry late in the evening, here was a place he could come. A few minutes before 12, a great box of bread was pushed out, and exactly on the hour, a portly, round-faced German took position by it, calling, "Ready." The whole line at once moved forward, each taking his loaf in turn and going his separate way. On this occasion, the ex-manager ate his as he went, plodding the dark streets in silence to his bed. By January, he had concluded that the game was up with him. Life had always seemed a precious thing, but now constant want and weakened vitality had made the charms of earth rather dull and inconspicuous. Several times, when fortune pressed most harshly, he thought he would end his troubles. But with a change of weather, or the arrival of a quarter or a dime, his mood would change, and he would wait. Each day he would find some old paper lying about and look into it, to see if there was any trace of Carrie. But all summer and fall he had looked in vain. Then he noticed that his eyes were beginning to hurt him, and this ailment rapidly increased until, in the dark chambers of the lodgings he frequented, he did not attempt to read. Bad and irregular eating was weakening every function of his body. The one recourse left him was to doze when a place offered, and he could get the money to occupy it. He was beginning to find, in his wretched clothing and meager state of body, that people took him for a chronic type of bum and beggar. Police bustled him along. Restaurant and lodging-house keepers turned him out promptly the moment he had his due. Pedestrians waved him off. He found it more and more difficult to get anything from anybody. At last he admitted to himself that the game was up. It was after a long series of appeals to pedestrians, in which he had been refused and refused, every one hastening from contact. "Give me a little something, will you, mister?" he said to the last one. "For God's sake, do. I'm starving." "Ah, get out," said the man, who happened to be a common type himself. "You're no good. I'll give you nothin'." Hurstwood put his hands, red from cold, down in his pockets. Tears came to his eyes. "That's right," he said. "I'm no good now. I was all right. I had money. I'm going to quit this." And, with death in his heart, he started down toward the Bowery. People had turned on the gas before and died. Why shouldn't he? He remembered a lodging house where there were little close rooms with gas jets in them, almost prearranged, he thought, for what he wanted to do, which rented for 15 cents. Then he remembered he had no 15 cents. On the way, he met a comfortable-looking gentleman coming, clean-shaven, out of a fine barber shop. "Would you mind giving me a little something?" he asked the man boldly. The gentleman looked him over and fished for a dime. Nothing but quarters were in his pocket. "Here," he said, handing him one to be rid of him. "Be off now." Hurstwood moved on, wondering. The sight of the large, bright coin pleased him a little. He remembered that he was hungry, and that he could get a bed for 10 cents. With this, the idea of death passed, for the time being, out of his mind. It was only when he could get nothing but insults that death seemed worthwhile. One day, in the middle of winter, the sharpest spell of the season set in. It broke gray and cold in the first day, and on the second snowed. Poor luck pursuing him, he had secured but 10 cents by nightfall, and this he had bad spent for food. At evening he found himself at the Boulevard and 67th Street, where he finally turned his face Bowery-ward. Especially fatigued because of the wandering propensity which had seized him in the morning, he now half dragged his wet feet, shuffling the soles upon the sidewalk. An old thin coat was turned up about his red ears. His cracked derby hat was pulled down till it turned them outward. His hands were in his pockets. "I'll just go down Broadway," he said to himself. When he reached 42nd Street, the fire signs were already blazing brightly. Crowds were hastening to dine. Through bright windows, at every corner, might be seen gay companies in luxuriant restaurants. There were coaches and crowded cable cars. In his weary and hungry state, he should never have come here. The contrast was too sharp. Even he was recalled keenly to better things. What's the use, he thought. It's all up with me. I'll quit this. People turned to look at him. So uncouth was his shambling figure. Several officers followed him with their eyes to see that he did not beg of anybody. Once he paused in an aimless, incoherent sort of way and looked through the windows of an imposing restaurant, before which blazed a fire sign, and through the large plate windows of which could be seen the red and gold decorations, the palms, the white napery, the shining glassware, and, above all, the comfortable crowd. Weak as his mind had become, his hunger was sharp enough to show the importance of this. He stopped stock still, his frayed trousers soaking in the slush, and peered foolishly in. "Eat," he mumbled. "That's right, eat. Nobody else wants any." Then his voice dropped even lower, and his mind half lost the fancy it had. "It's mighty cold," he said. "Awful cold." At Broadway and 39th Street was blazing an incandescent fire. Carrie's name, Carrie Medenda, it read, and the casino company. All the wet, snowy sidewalk was bright with this radiated fire. It was so bright that it attracted Hurstwood's gaze. He looked up, and then at a large gilt-framed poster board, on which was a fine lithograph of Carrie, life-size. Hurstwood gazed at it a moment, snuffling and hunching one shoulder, as if something were scratching him. He was so run down, however, that his mind was not exactly clear. "That's you," he said at last, addressing her. "Wasn't good enough for you, was I, huh?" He lingered, trying to think logically. This was no longer possible with him. "She's got it," he said incoherently, thinking of money. "Let her give me some." He started around to the side door. Then he forgot what he was going for and paused, pushing his hands deeper to warm the wrists. Suddenly it returned. The stage door. That was it. He approached that entrance and went in. "Well," said the attendant, staring at him. Seeing him pause, he went over and shoved him. "Get out of here," he said. "I want to see Miss Medenda," he said. "You do, eh?" the other said, almost tickled at the spectacle. "Get out of here," and he shoved him again. Hurstwood had no strength to resist. "I want to see Miss Medenda," he tried to explain, even as he was being hustled away. "I'm all right, The man gave him a last push and closed the door. As he did so, Hurstwood slipped and fell in the snow. It hurt him, and some vague sense of shame returned. He began to cry and swear foolishly. "God-damned dog," he said. "Damned old cur," wiping the slush from his worthless coat. I hired people such as you once." Now a fierce feeling against Carrie welled up. Just one fierce, angry thought before the whole thing slipped out of his mind. "She owes me something to eat," he said. "She owes it to me." Hopelessly, he turned back into Broadway again and slopped onward and away, begging, crying, losing track of his thoughts, one after another, as a mind decayed and disjointed is wont to do. It was a truly wintry evening, a few days later, when his one distinct mental decision was reached. Already, at 4 o'clock, the somber hue of night was thickening the air. A heavy snow was falling, a fine picking, whipping snow, borne forward by a swift wind in long, thin lines. The streets were bedded with it, 6 inches of cold, soft carpet, churned to a dirty brown by the crush of teams and the feet of men. Along Broadway, men picked their way in ulsters and umbrellas. Along the Bowery, men slouched through it with collars and hats pulled over their ears. In the former thoroughfare, businessmen and travelers were making for comfortable hotels. In the latter, crowds on cold errands shifted past dingy stores, in the deep recesses of which lights were already gleaming. There were early lights in the cable cars, whose usual clatter was reduced by the mantle around the wheels. The whole city was muffled by this fast thickening mantle. In her comfortable chambers at the Waldorf, Carrie was reading at the time Pierre Coriat, which Ames had recommended to her. It was so strong, and Ames' mere recommendation had so aroused her interest that she caught nearly the full sympathetic significance of it. For the first time it was being borne in upon her how silly and worthless had been her earlier reading as a whole. Becoming wearied, however, she yawned and came to the window, looking out upon the old winding procession of carriages winding up Fifth Avenue. "Isn't it bad?" she observed to Lola. "Terrible," said that little lady, joining her. "I hope it snows enough to go sleigh riding." "Oh dear," said Carrie, with whom the sufferings of Father Goriot were still keen. "That's all you think of. Aren't you sorry for the people who haven't anything tonight?" "Of course I am," said Lola, "but what can I do? I haven't anything." Carrie smiled. "You wouldn't care if you had," she returned. "I would too," said Lola, "but people never gave me anything when I was hard up." "Isn't that just awful?" said Carrie, studying the winter storm. "Look at that man over there," laughed Lola, who had caught sight of someone falling down. "How sheepish men look when they fall, don't they?" "We'll have to take a coach tonight," answered Carrie, absently. In the lobby of the Imperial, Mr. Charles Druitt was just arriving, shaking the snow from a very handsome ulster. Bad weather had driven him home early, and stirred his desire for those pleasures which shut out the snow and the gloom of life. A good dinner, the company of a young woman, and an evening at the theater were the chief things for him. "Why, hello, Harry," he said, addressing a lounger in one of the comfortable lobby chairs. "How are you?" "Oh, about 6 and 6, said the other. "Rotten weather, isn't it?" "Well, I should say," said the other. "I've been just sitting here, thinking where I'd go tonight." "Come along with me," said Druitt. "I can introduce you to some dead swell." "Who is it?" said the other. "Oh, a couple of girls over here in 40th Street. We could have a dandy time. I was just looking for you." "Supposing we could get 'em and take 'em out to dinner?" "Sure," said Druitt. "Wait'll I go upstairs and change my clothes." Well, I'll be in the barber shop, said the other. I want to get a shave. All right, said Druitt, creaking off in his good shoes toward the elevator. The old butterfly was as light on the wing as ever. On an incoming vestibuled Pullman, speeding at 40 miles an hour through the snow of the evening, were 3 others, all related. First call for dinner in the dining car, a Pullman servitor was announcing as he hastened through the aisle in snow-white apron and jacket. I don't believe I want to play any more, said the youngest, a dark-haired beauty turned supercilious by fortune, as she pushed a euchre hand away from her. Shall we go into dinner? Inquired her husband, who was all that fine raiment can make. Oh, not yet, she answered. I don't want to play any more, though. Jessica, said her mother, who was also a study in what good clothing can do for age, push that pin down in your tie. It's coming up. Jessica obeyed, incidentally touching at her lovely hair and looking at a little jewel-faced watch. Her husband studied her, for beauty, even cold, is fascinating from one point of view. Well, we won't have much more of this weather, he said. It only takes 2 weeks to get to Rome. Mrs. Hurstwood nestled comfortably in her corner and smiled. It was so nice to be the mother-in-law of a rich young man, one whose financial state had borne her personal inspection. Do you suppose the boat will sail promptly? Asked Jessica, if it keeps up like this. Oh, yes, answered her husband. It won't make any difference. Passing down the aisle came a very fair-haired banker's son, also of Chicago, who had long eyed the supercilious beauty. Even now he did not hesitate to glance at her, and she was conscious of it. With a specially conjured show of indifference, she turned her pretty face wholly away. It was not wifely modesty at all. By so much was her pride satisfied. At this moment, Hurstwood stood before a dirty 4-story building in a side street quite near the Bowery, whose one-time coat of buff had been changed by soot and rain. He mingled with a crowd of men, a crowd of which had been, and was still, growing by degrees. It began with the approach of 2 or 3 who hung around the closed wooden doors and beat their feet to keep warm. They had on faded derby hats with dents in them. Their misfit coats were heavy with melted snow and turned up at the collars. Their trousers were mere bags, frayed at the bottom and wobbly over big, soppy shoes, torn at the sides and worn almost to shreds. They made no effort to go in, but shifted ruefully about, digging their hands deep in their pockets and leering at the crowd and the increasing lamps. With the minutes increased the number. 3 were old men with grizzled beards and sunken eyes, men who were comparatively young but shrunken by diseases, men who were middle-aged. None were fat. There was a face in the thick of the collection which was as white as drained veal. There was another red as a brick. Some came with thin, rounded shoulders, others with wooden legs, still others with frames so lean that clothes only flapped about them. There were great ears, swollen noses, thick lips, and above all, red, bloodshot eyes. Not a normal, healthy face in the whole mass, not a straight figure, not a straightforward, steady glance. In the drive of the wind and sleet They pushed in on one another. There were wrists unprotected by coat or pocket, which were red with cold. There were ears half covered by every conceivable semblance of a hat, which still looked stiff and bitten. In the snow they shifted, now one foot, now another, almost rocking in unison. With the growth of the crowd about the door came a murmur. It was not conversation, but a running comment directed at anyone in general. It contained oaths and slang phrases. By damn, I wish they'd hurry up. Look at the copper watchin'. Maybe it ain't winter nuther. I wished I was in Sing Sing. Now as a sharper lash of wind cut down, and they huddled closer. It was an edging, shifting, pushing throng. There was no anger, no pleading, no threatening words. It was all sullen endurance, unlightened by either wit or good fellowship. A carriage went jingling by with some reclining figure in it. One of the men nearest the door saw it. Look at the bloke ridin'. He ain't so cold. Hey, 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 yelled another, the carriage having long since passed out of hearing. Little by little the night crept on. Along the walk a crowd turned out on its way home. Men and shop girls went by with quick steps. The cross-town cars began to be crowded. The gas lamps were blazing, and every window bloomed ruddy with a steady flame. Still the crowd hung around the door, unwavering. "Ain't they ever going to open up?" queried a hoarse voice suggestively. This seemed to renew the general interest in the closed door, and many gazed in that direction. They looked at it as dumb brutes look, as dogs paw and whine and study the knob. They shifted and blinked and muttered, now a curse, now a comment. Still they waited, and still the snow whirled and cut them with biting flakes. On old hats and peaked shoulders it was piling. It gathered in little heaps and curves, and no one brushed it off. In the center of the crowd, the warmth and steam melted it, and water trickled off hat rims and down noses, which the owners could not reach to scratch. On the outer rim, the piles remained unmelted. Hurstwood, who could not get in the center, stood with head lowered to the weather, and bent his form. A light appeared through the transom overhead. It sent a thrill of possibility through the watchers. There was a murmur of recognition. At last the bars grated inside, and the crowd pricked up its ears. Footsteps shuffled within, and it murmured again. Someone called, "Slow up there now," and then the door opened. It was push and jam for a minute, with grim beast silence to prove its quality, and then it melted inward, like logs floating, and disappeared. There were wet hats and wet shoulders, a cold, shrunken, disgruntled mass, pouring in between bleak walls. It was just 6 o'clock, and there was supper in every hurried pedestrian's face, and yet no supper was provided here. Nothing but beds. Hurstwood laid down his 15 cents and crept up with weary steps to his allotted room. It was a dingy affair, wooden, dusty, hard. A small gas jet furnished sufficient light for so rueful a corner. He said, clearing his throat and locking the door. Now he began leisurely to take off his clothes, but stopped first with his coat and tucked it along the crack under the door. His vest he arranged in the same place. His old, wet, cracked hat he laid softly upon the table. Then he pulled off his shoes and lay down. It seemed as if he thought a while, for now he arose and turned the gas out, standing calmly in the blackness, hidden from view. After a few moments, in which he reviewed nothing but merely hesitated, he turned the gas on again, but applied no match. Even then he stood there, hidden wholly in that kindness which is night, while the uprising fumes filled the room. When the odor reached his nostrils, he quit his attitude and fumbled for his bed. "What's the use?" he said weakly, as he stretched himself to rest. And now Carrie had attained that which in the beginning seemed life's object, or at least such fraction of it as human beings ever attain of their original desires. She could look about on her gowns and carriage, her furniture and bank accounts. Friends there were, as the world takes it, those who would bow and smile in acknowledgment of her success. For these she had once craved. Applause there was, and publicity, once far off, essential things, but now grown trivial and indifferent. Beauty also, her type of loveliness, and yet she was lonely. In her rocking chair she sat, but not otherwise engaged, singing and dreaming. Thus in life is ever the intellectual and the emotional nature, the mind that reasons and the mind that feels. Of one comes the men of action, generals and statesmen, of the other the poets and dreamers, artists all. As harps in the wind, the latter respond to every breath of fancy, voicing in their moods all the ebb and flow of the ideal. Man has not yet comprehended the dreamer any more than he has the ideal. For him the laws and morals of the world are unduly severe. Ever hearkening to the sound of beauty, straining for the flash of its distant wings, he watches to follow, wearying his feet in traveling. So watched Carrie, so followed, rocking and singing. And it must be remembered that reason had little part in this. Chicago dawning, she saw the city offering more of loveliness than she had ever known, and instinctively, by force of her moods alone, clung to it. In fine raiment and elegant surroundings, men seemed to be contented. Hence, she drew near these things. Chicago, New York, Druitt, Hurstwood, the world of fashion and the world of stage. These were but incidents. Not them, but that which they represented, she longed for. Time proved the representation false. Oh, the tangle of human life! How dimly as yet we see. Here was Carrie, in the beginning poor, unsophisticated, emotional, responding with desire to everything most lovely in life, yet finding herself turned as by a wall. Law is to say, be allured, if you will, by everything lovely, but draw not nigh unless by righteousness. Convention to say, you shall not better your situation, save by honest labor. If honest labor be unremunerative and difficult to endure, if it be the long, long road which never reaches beauty, but wearies the feet and the heart, if the drag to follow beauty be such that one abandons the admired way, taking rather the despised path leading to her dreams quickly, who shall cast the first stone? Not evil, but longing for that which is better, more often directs the steps of the erring. Not evil, but goodness, more often allures the feeling mind, unused to reason. Amid the tinsel and shine of her state walked Carrie, unhappy. As when Druitt took her, she had thought, now I am lifted into that which is best. As when Hurstwood seemingly offered her the better way, now I am happy. But since the world goes its way past all those who will not partake of its folly, she now found herself alone. Her purse was open to him whose need was greatest. In her walks on Broadway, she no longer thought of the elegance of the creatures who passed her. Had they more of that peace and beauty that glimmered afar off, then they were to be envied. Druitt abandoned his claim and was seen no more. Of Hurstwood's death she was not even aware. A slow black boat setting out from the pier at 27th Street upon its weekly errand bore, with many others, his nameless body to the potter's field. Thus passed all that was of interest concerning these twain in their relationship to her. Their influence upon her life is explicable alone by the nature of her longings. Time was when both represented for her all that was most potent in earthly success. They were the personal representatives of a state most blessed to attain, the titled ambassadors of comfort and peace, aglow with their credentials. It is but natural that when the world which they represented no longer allured her, its ambassadors should be discredited. Even had Hurstwood returned in his original beauty and glory, he could not now have allured her. She had learned that in his world, as in her own present state, was not happiness. Sitting alone, she was now an illustration of the devious ways by which one who feels, rather than reasons, may be led in the pursuit of beauty. Though often disillusioned, she was still waiting for that halcyon day when she should be led forth among dreams become real. Ames had pointed out a farther step, but on and on beyond that, if accomplished, would lie others for her. It was forever to be the pursuit of that radiance of delight which tints the distant hilltops of the world. O Carrie, Carrie, O blind strivings of the human heart! Onward, onward, it saith, and where beauty leads, there it follows. Whether it be the tinkle of a lone sheep bell, or some quiet landscape, or the glimmer of beauty in sylvan places, or the show of soul in some passing eye, the heart knows and makes answer, following. It is when the feet weary and hope seems vain that the heartaches and the longings arise. Know then that for you is neither surfeit nor content. In your rocking chair, by your window dreaming, shall you long, alone. In your rocking chair, by your window, shall you dream such happiness as you may never feel. The end. End of chapter 47. Recording by Andrea Deans. End of Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser.